Right now, wherever you are, I want you to do something. Pick a habit you hate, something you keep doing even though you've decided more than once to stop. Maybe it's the phone you reach for before your eyes fully open, the food you eat at midnight when you're not even hungry, the way you zone out midway through something important and open a new tab, the cigarette, the drink, the scroll. Got it? Good. Hold that habit in your mind. Now try to remember the last time you decided to do it. You can't, because you didn't decide. It just happened. And that absence of decision is the most alarming thing happening inside your skull right now. Because here's what neuroscience has confirmed in the last decade that most people are completely unaware of. Your brain doesn't just tolerate bad habits, it builds infrastructure for them. It carves physical tunnels into your neural architecture, reinforces those tunnels every single time you repeat the behavior, and then, and this is the part that changes everything, it removes the decision entirely. The habit stops being a choice. It becomes the brain's default state. But that's not the strange part. The strange part is why it does this. And when you understand the reason, when you see the ancient survival logic buried inside this mechanism, you won't just understand your habits differently, you'll understand your brain differently. And you might, for the first time, understand why willpower was never going to be enough. Let's start with a question that sounds simple but isn't. What is a habit, actually? Most people think a habit is a behavior you repeat so often it becomes automatic. That's close. But it's missing the most important part. A habit is not a behavior, a habit is a circuit, a physical, electrochemical pathway burned into the tissue of your brain through repetition. When neuroscientists image the brains of people performing well established habits, they don't see active decision making regions lighting up. They see those regions go quiet. The prefrontal cortex, the seat of judgment, reasoning, long term planning, essentially steps back, deactivates, clocks out, and the basal ganglia takes over. The basal ganglia is one of the most ancient structures in the vertebrate brain. It predates the prefrontal cortex by hundreds of millions of years. It doesn't think, it doesn't plan, it runs programs. Stored, compressed, efficient behavioral sequences that can be executed without conscious input. Think of the prefrontal cortex as the CEO of your brain. Smart, strategic, deliberate, but expensive. It burns glucose. It fatigues. It needs sleep. The basal ganglia is the operating system. It doesn't get tired. It doesn't need convincing. It just runs. And here's what most people miss. Your brain wants to move behaviors from the CEO to the operating system. This is not a bug. It's the brain's most powerful energy conservation strategy. Every habit you automate frees up cognitive resources for something else. The problem is, the brain doesn't discriminate. It automates whatever you repeat, useful or destructive. So by the time you're asking yourself why you can't stop, the behavior isn't in the decision making part of your brain anymore. It's in the ancient machinery. Here's where it gets interesting. In the 1990s, neuroscientist Wolfram Schultz at Cambridge was studying dopamine neurons in monkeys. He was trying to understand reward processing, and he found something that nobody expected. When he gave a monkey an unexpected reward, a squirt of juice, dopamine neurons fired intensely. That made sense. Pleasure triggers dopamine. But when he started signaling the reward before giving it using a light or a sound, something strange happened. The dopamine neurons stopped firing at the reward itself. They started firing at the signal, the anticipation, the cue. The moment the monkey heard the sound and knew the juice was coming, what Schultz had discovered was something called a predictive reward signal, and it completely reframed our understanding of dopamine. Dopamine is not the pleasure chemical. Dopamine is the wanting chemical, the anticipation chemical, the I'm about to get something chemical. And this distinction changes everything because your bad habits are not driven by pleasure. They're driven by the prediction of pleasure. The moment you see your phone, your dopamine spikes not when you actually check it. The moment you smell fast food, your dopamine spikes not when you actually eat it. The craving happens before the behavior. The brain is already rewarding itself for something it hasn't done yet. This is the hook your brain has installed inside itself. But the mechanism goes deeper than that. In 1999, researchers at MIT discovered something extraordinary about what happens in the brain as habits form. When rats were placed in a maze and rewarded at the end, their brains were intensely active throughout the entire run, sniffing, exploring, evaluating. Dopamine fired all through the maze. But as the rats ran the same maze hundreds of times and learned the route perfectly, brain activity didn't stay constant. It did something unexpected. It collapsed. Activity during the middle of the maze dropped almost to baseline, but activity at two specific points surged. At the start of the maze, the cue, and at the end, the reward. The brain had compressed the entire behavioral sequence into a single neural unit. Everything in between the actual behavior became invisible to conscious processing. Scientists call this chunking. The brain takes a complex sequence and files it as one compressed package. This is how you can drive home on autopilot while thinking about something else. How you can type without thinking about individual keys. How you can brush your teeth while mentally running through tomorrow's schedule. And it's how a bad habit can consume you before you've even noticed it started. The loop is cue, routine, reward. But by the time a habit is fully entrenched, the brain has chunked the entire loop into a single trigger response unit. You see the cue, and the end is already in motion. But here's where the story becomes stranger. If habits are just efficient behavioral programs, you'd expect they'd be easy to overwrite. Run a new program, install a better routine. Logic dictates, just decide to do something different. Except that's not how the brain is built, and the reason why takes us somewhere completely unexpected. To understand why your brain clings to bad habits, even when you consciously want to change them, we have to go deeper into the architecture, into the structure of memory itself. Because it turns out, habits aren't stored where you think they are, and the mechanism that protects them from deletion is the same mechanism that keeps you alive. Let me describe what's happening inside your brain right now, at the microscopic level. Every time you perform a behavior, any behavior neurons fire in a specific sequence. Electricity jumps across synapses. Neurotransmitters flood the gaps between nerve cells. And each time that sequence fires, something physical happens to those synapses. They strengthen. The synaptic connection becomes more efficient. The gap narrows. The signal travels faster with less resistance. This is called long term potentiation, and it's the biological basis of memory, learning, and habit. Neuroscientist Donald Hebb captured it in 1949 with a phrase that still holds today: neurons that fire together wire together. But what nobody tells you is what happens on the other side of that equation. When a neural pathway is used repeatedly, the brain doesn't just strengthen those connections, it myelinates them. Myelin is a white, fatty substance that wraps around nerve axons like insulation around electrical wire. And every time you repeat a behavior, good or bad, oligodendrocyte cells rush to the associated neural pathway and lay down another layer of myelin. Each layer increases the speed of signal transmission by up to 100 times. The pathway becomes faster, more automatic, more dominant. This is measurable. Neuroscientists can actually look at the white matter of a highly trained musician's brain and see the difference compared to a non musician. Thicker myelin, faster circuits. The habit is written into the physical structure. And here's the critical thing about myelin: it doesn't unwrap just because you decide to stop. Once a pathway is myelinated, it doesn't disappear when you stop using it. It waits, dormant but intact, which is why recovered addicts can relapse after years of sobriety when exposed to a single cue from their old environment. The circuit is still there, insulated, ready to fire. This is not weakness. This is ancient biological logic. And to understand why your brain does this, we have to go back, way back, to where this whole system comes from. Imagine you're a primate living on the African savanna 2 million years ago. Your brain has a critical task: survive today, find food, avoid predators, conserve energy, reproduce. In that environment, the behaviors that kept you alive were behaviors worth automating. You didn't want to consciously reevaluate every morning whether water was a good idea. You wanted that behavior to run automatically with maximum efficiency, driven by the most powerful motivational circuitry in your nervous system, and that's exactly what your brain built. The dopamine driven reward system wasn't designed for the modern world. It was designed for a world where pleasure was rare, calories were scarce, and repetitive survival behaviors were the difference between life and death. The problem is, you're running that ancient hardware in a world deliberately engineered to exploit it. And this changes everything about how you understand your habits. Here's what most people miss about the modern bad habit landscape: your phone is not an accident. Neither is fast food. Neither is the infinite scroll, the autoplay video, the casino, the cigarette, or the processed snack designed to hit a specific combination of salt, fat, and sugar that no natural food has ever achieved. These are products of reverse engineering. Every major technology and food company in the world employs researchers, behavioral scientists, neuroscientists, addiction specialists whose literal job is to find the neural buttons your ancient brain cannot ignore and press them repeatedly, predictably, profitably. B. F. Skinner discovered in the 1930s that the most powerful behavioral reinforcement schedule is not constant reward, it's variable reward. Unpredictable, intermittent payoffs produce the strongest, most extinction resistant behavioral patterns observed in any organism ever studied. The slot machine was built on this principle. So was the social media feed. Every pull of a slot machine arm, every refresh of a feed, is a variable reward cycle firing directly into your dopamine anticipation system. And because dopamine spikes highest in anticipation, not at reward, the brain learns to crave the check itself. The pull, the scroll, the search for a notification that may or may not be there. You're not addicted to social media. You're addicted to the possibility of something interesting being there. And here's where biology becomes genuinely alarming. When the dopamine system is repeatedly overstimulated, the brain adapts. Specifically, it downregulates dopamine receptors. There are fewer of them, the signal gets weaker. The same stimulus produces a smaller response. This is tolerance, and it doesn't just apply to drugs. It applies to anything that hijacks the dopamine system: screens, sugar, gambling, even toxic relationship patterns. The result is a neurological trap. You need more stimulation to get the same dopamine response you used to get from less. Your baseline pleasure, the everyday satisfaction of a quiet moment, a simple meal, a real conversation, starts to feel flat, understimulating, boring. Neuroscientists call this hedonic adaptation, but the more accurate term might be sensory numbing. Your brain's reward circuitry has been recalibrated by repeated artificial overstimulation to find ordinary life insufficient. And this connects to something even deeper, something that reaches beyond habit, beyond dopamine, all the way into the aging brain. Because here's where the stakes change completely. The same dopamine downregulation that makes it hard to enjoy a quiet afternoon also does something far more serious over decades. It destabilizes the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is not just where you make decisions, it's where you regulate emotion, manage impulse, plan for the future, and critically, where you maintain the capacity for cognitive flexibility, the ability to change your mind, update your beliefs, break a pattern. Research from the National Institutes of Health has shown that chronic dopaminergic overstimulation, the kind produced by years of high stimulation habit loops, physically degrades prefrontal white matter. The same myelination process that strengthens bad habit pathways when applied to prefrontal circuits under chronic stress and overstimulation actually begins to thin. The circuits for judgment, impulse control, and long term thinking physically weaken, while the circuits for the automatic, habitual, reward seeking behaviors physically strengthen. This is not a metaphor. This is measurable neural architecture changing over years, and the implications extend far beyond bad habits. The prefrontal cortex is also the last brain region to fully develop, completing myelination around age 25, and the first to show age related decline. It is, neurologically speaking, the most expensive and most vulnerable real estate in your skull. What you repeatedly do in your 20s and 30s shapes the physical structure of that region in your 40s and 50s. The neural pathways you strengthen with repetition are the pathways that will define what kind of thinking comes easily or becomes impossible as you age. And now consider this: memory, specifically episodic memory, the kind that lets you recall experiences, not just perform routines, lives in the hippocampus. The hippocampus is extraordinarily sensitive to one molecule, cortisol, the stress hormone. Chronic stress, the kind generated by chronic guilt, chronic dissatisfaction, chronic stimulation deprivation, floods the hippocampus with cortisol. And sustained cortisol exposure does something that took researchers years to accept because it was so disturbing. It causes the hippocampus to physically shrink. Dendritic branches wither. Neural volume decreases. The structure that encodes your life experience, that holds the story of who you are, begins to compress under the weight of chronic neurological distress, the stress of bad habits, the frustration of repeated failure to change, the shame cycle, the late night regret. These are not just emotional experiences, they are neurotoxic events occurring in the memory center of your brain. And the connection goes one level deeper still. Research published in Nature Neuroscience has revealed that the gut microbiome, the ecosystem of bacteria living in your digestive tract, communicates with the brain through the vagus nerve via a pathway now called the gut brain axis. And ultra processed foods, the category of food most strongly associated with modern bad habit loops, alter the composition of gut bacteria in ways that directly affect serotonin production, inflammatory signaling, and the sensitivity of reward pathways in the brain. Roughly 90% of your body's serotonin, the neurochemical associated with baseline mood, calm, and satisfaction, is produced in the gut, not the brain. The gut, which means the food habits that corrupt your dopamine system also corrupt the microbial ecosystem that produces the chemical your brain needs to feel stable. The bad habit isn't just affecting your behavior, it is rewriting your neurochemistry, your microbiome, your cortisol response, your hippocampal volume, your prefrontal architecture, your capacity for long term cognition. The habit and the biology are one system, and that system is moving, always moving in one direction or another. So let's come back to where we started. That habit you thought of at the beginning, the one you do without deciding to, you now know what's actually happening. Not metaphorically, physically. The cue activates your basal ganglia, not your prefrontal cortex. Your dopamine neurons fire before the behavior begins. In anticipation of a reward your brain has predicted with mathematical precision based on thousands of past repetitions. The behavior executes as a chunked neural program, compressed and insulated by layers of myelin that have been building since the first time you repeated that behavior. The reward arrives weaker than it used to be, because downregulated dopamine receptors mean diminishing returns, but just strong enough to confirm the loop and set it up to fire again tomorrow. Meanwhile, the cue itself, the sight, the smell, the time of day, the emotional state, the specific location has been encoded so deeply into your predictive circuitry that it doesn't just trigger a desire. It suppresses the neural systems that would allow you to consciously evaluate whether the desire is worth following. The brain turns off its own override switch on purpose because that's how efficient habit execution works. This is the architecture of entrenchment, and it is not a personal failing. It is the precise, elegant, devastating result of a brain doing exactly what 300 million years of evolution built it to do, minimizing energy expenditure, automating behavior, and prioritizing survival. Except the survival environment has changed, and the brain hasn't been updated. You are running prehistoric software in a world that has hacked your neural code and is using it to sell you things, keep you on platforms, and extract behavioral patterns that have nothing to do with your well being or your survival. But here's the part that actually matters, the thing this entire cascade of biology has been building toward. The same plasticity that built the bad habit can build something else. Neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to reorganize itself by forming new neural connections, does not stop in adulthood. It does not stop at 30, at 50, at 70. The mechanisms are slower. The myelin takes longer to form. The cortisol environment matters more. But the biological machinery is present and operational throughout the human lifespan. Every time you intercept a habit loop, every time you notice the cue and consciously choose a different response, you are doing something that is physically real. You are beginning to myelinate an alternative pathway. You are using the prefrontal cortex to override the basal ganglia, and in doing so, you are strengthening the prefrontal circuits that make future override easier. The first interception is the hardest. The neural resistance is highest. The old pathway is dominant, insulated, automatic. The new pathway is thin, slow, unmyelinated. But repetition changes the equation. Every repetition adds myelin to the new path. Every repetition subtly weakens the dominance of the old one, not by erasing it, but by building a competing circuit that, over time, becomes faster, more accessible, more automatic. You cannot delete the old habit. That circuit will remain in your basal ganglia for life. But you can build a highway next to it, and the biological law is simple. The pathway that fires most frequently becomes the pathway that fires most easily. The question is not whether your brain can change, the brain is always changing. Neural pathways are always strengthening or weakening based on what you repeatedly do. The question is which direction you're moving. Because right now, in this moment, every thought you have, every behavior you repeat, every cue you respond to automatically or consciously choose to override is sending signals to oligodendrocyte cells throughout your cortex. And those cells are quietly, invisibly doing what they have always done, wrapping myelin around the future you are building. Neuroscience didn't discover that the brain is unchangeable. It discovered the opposite. It discovered that the brain is always changing precisely, physically, structurally in response to what you do most often. The only question that has ever mattered is whether you are shaping that change intentionally or letting something else shape it for you.